I'm David Emmon. I'm from the Global Research and Analysis team at Kaspersky Lab. So obviously looking at this kind of attack, particularly targeted attacks, is part of our remit. So I'm going to start by talking about banking Trojans. So these are programs which cyber criminals look to put onto people's computers with a view to capturing information that they can use then to access people's bank accounts. So this is probably the oldest form of trying to steal money from people who are online, actually, and dates back to round about 2003, 2004 in terms of when it started. Typically, these things are spread through social engineering. So people will trick us into installing them, or they will install via a drive-by download. So we go to a website which has been compromised by the attackers, and when we view the content, their malicious script executes and it gets installed in the background and we don't know anything about it. It could be that they're modifying the web page in order to capture information when we're in the middle of a banking transaction. It could be that they're using a keylogger to capture keystrokes. But in one way or another, anyway, they're modifying the system in such a way as to capture that information to get access to our bank accounts. Now, the key thing about this type of threat is actually it's not targeted at all. It's very random, very speculative. They send out, you know, maybe a phishing email to many, many people hoping to capture just a few of them. But it's not targeted at you. It's not targeted at me. Anybody who's unlucky enough to get infected could be on the receiving end of this. It's worth pointing out also that they will also look to capture other information that can help them. So if people are using a mobile device as a second factor of authentication, then it may be that they don't just need a static password, an account number, they also need that one-time passcode. So they develop also code to go on a mobile device to work as a sort of ancillary element really of the overall attack and to capture that. So they will trick people into putting it onto the mobile phone by basically altering the HTML and to say, well, look, we need to actually add another level of security for your mobile. Give us your mobile number, we'll send you a link to install a security certificate, and you get infected that way. In terms of numbers, actually, we've seen a relative slowdown in the numbers, or at least not as big a growth. What we've found actually over the last year, 18 months, is relative decline in numbers of banking Trojans, relative decline in ransomware programs, but a massive hike in cryptocurrency mining. But that doesn't mean this is going away anytime soon. The numbers are still pretty big. In 2017, we saw about 1.2 million attacks. And obviously, that's just what we've got visibility into. So you can multiply that by, you know, the number of vendors. And even then, you're going to not include people who are not protected at all. So what about other attacks? Well, I want to talk about ATM jackpotting. And basically what we mean by that is getting money from an ATM in an unauthorized way. And there are different ways of doing that. The one thing I would say is that this is beginning to become something which is mainstream. And this is true generally of cyber security. But, you know, a few years ago, people wouldn't have heard of ATM jackpotting. But now it's become something that, you know, the FBI sends alerts out on, or, you know, news feeds will cover this as well. So what about the different ways of doing it? Well, right now, we've got about 21 different malware families overall which are targeted on this particular approach. And within that, obviously, there's lots of different variants of those 21 malware families. Some of them are listed up there. You may have heard of some of them, you may not. In terms of geography, it's a worldwide phenomenon. This looks at just at the ATM stuff. It's not looking at the wider banking attacks. And you can see there are sort of hot spots. The red stuff is where there's particular focus, the yellow stuff where there's less of a focus. But it's certainly a global issue for sure. And they're looking to steal money. They're looking to steal card information. The methods, well, one is to use software and to actually locally modify the ATM. So the guys will look online, they'll obtain a key to the actual ATM, they will approach the ATM and they will look to install software on it, which basically gives them control of the computer, which is controlling those transactions. And then typically it will require local access in order to get the money to pay out. So they're tapping in a series of numbers which the software has programmed the ATM to respond to. So examples would be Tubkin, which was pretty big a couple of years ago. Again, a worldwide series of attacks, but it's a quick way of making money. Hardware is another option. Again, get a key online, open up the ATM, switch it into supervisor mode, install your black box within that, which is basically allowing you to capture the information, and then maybe remove it at some point in the future once you've made enough money. And obviously reproduce that across many, many ATMs, and there's quite a lot of money at stake. Now, both of these are possible because there's often no protection at all on those systems. There's no sort of whitelisting of software to limit what can run on the ATM. There's no authentication between the different modules and the main module within there, which obviously gives them scope for doing this kind of manipulation. Now, the third mechanism is remote control of the ATM, which really requires the attackers to get access to banking infrastructure and then use that as a stepping stone for the ATM attack. So with that one, they're controlling it really through their access to the bank, whereas with the previous one, local using software, they're probably remotely controlling it, maybe with a smartphone, for example, or literally visiting the ATM and tapping in numbers. Now, I've put the links there. I mean, if you're interested, you can go up and do a search for Kaspersky ATM malware, and we've got a couple of short videos which show how each of these works, how these scenarios play out. Now, on that third one, of using kind of remote control through the bank, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, give a bit more detail. But first, it's worth pointing out that we're starting to see as-a-service offerings for these things. Now, this is pretty typical. So what we find in any particular area of cybercrime is that people will develop technology, software, malware, in order to carry out whatever operation they want to do. And then at some stage, they will try and monetize that further by selling the ability to do that to other people. And so you get these as-a-service offerings where people are saying, well, actually, we'll give you all the modules you need, all the instructions you need to carry out this kind of crime. And we've seen that with ransomware. We've seen it with other areas of cybercrime. And it's just as true for ATM jackpotting as well. So this particular one is a toolkit called Cutlet Maker. And it's Russian-based. And the Russian for cutlet is kotleta. But it's also a slang term for bundle of money, which is what these guys are trying to reference there about making some cutlets is let's get some money from these ATMs. So what about attacks on financial institutions? Probably one of the biggest, or most notorious at least, was Carbonac. And between 2013 and 15, these guys operated really without anybody having visibility into what they were doing. But their MO was really to deliver malware initially into a banking organization through social engineering. So they would send phishing emails with an attachment. They were using an exploit, or they had exploit code tapping into a vulnerability in the application they were sending to people so that when they double-clicked on it, it automatically installed their code. So what they did that was pretty random, but except for the fact that they were targeting a particular bank. But what they were then looking to do was to gain lateral movement across the organization because they wanted to find those people within the organization who had the ability to move money around or the ability to connect to ATMs and get them to spew out money. So they were using recording capabilities on those computers, video recording, audio, in order to kind of capture the environment until they found somebody who was strategic from their point of view. Now, at that point, they were doing one of three things. They were either loading money onto money mule accounts that they'd pre-arranged, or they were doing bank transfers, international bank transfers, or they were instructing the ATM to spill out money, and members of the gang would be in particular locations to collect that money. And obviously they could operate at whatever time they thought was going to be safest to do it, because the middle of the day in a busy high street is not the time to just sit yourself there for the whole afternoon. But obviously these things operate 24/7. These guys are still in operation. There was an arrest of somebody alleged to be part of this gang earlier this year, but obviously it's seldom the case that arresting one person is going to close down a whole operation. This was targeting institutions worldwide, so the US, Germany, Ukraine, Russia, lots and lots of places, about 100 different institutions worldwide, and it's estimated that they made about $1 billion. And this is just what we saw, so the chances are it's higher than that. They reinvented themselves, so about 12 months after this, they came back, and this time they weren't just targeting financial institutions, they were going after account departments within other enterprises as well. So they were diversifying slightly, but still at large, still doing much the same kinds of things. So that was 2015. Back in 2016, we saw some other attacks, and one of them is this one, GC Man. Again, these guys were looking to get into organizations with spear phishing and then looking to move laterally using things like Meterpreter and other tools which would give them lateral movement. They were using Mimikatz as a way of capturing passwords on that system. And again, they were looking for the strategic locations in the organization, but their purpose was to plant a cron script in the system which would conduct transactions basically at the rate of about $200 every minute. So not a vast amount of money, but obviously that builds up over a day, a week, a month. So yeah, they were looking to make money in that kind of direct way through the compromising the bank infrastructure. Another one was Metal, about the same time. They were taking a slightly different approach. I mean, the beginning of it was very similar, which was get into the organization with social engineering, trick somebody into clicking on something they shouldn't, install the malware, get to the strategic points in the organization. And what they were doing was slightly different. They were then cancelling transactions. So a member of the group would be out and about, feet on the ground, let's say with a bank card from institution A, going to an ATM from institution B or C or D, and they were withdrawing money, and then the guys who were controlling the bank infrastructure were just zeroing that, so the transaction never happened as far as the crooks on the ground were concerned, so they could just keep repeating this operation without ever going overdrawn. More recently, in 2017, we saw a wave of attacks, not just on banking institutions, they were on telecoms and others as well, but part of it was banking. What was notable about this was that actually it was operating as fileless malware. So it wasn't installing files on the disk. Well, initially it was, but then cleaning it up. It wasn't modifying the registry or doing any other stuff. It existed just in memory. Now, why do that? Well, you lose in terms of persistence, because if somebody powers that computer off or reboots it, gone. Memory's cleared, the threat goes with it. But what they lose in persistence, they gain in stealth. It's much less likely to be noticeable. And if people do forensics after the event, it's much harder to find any trace of the malware because it has less of a point of presence on that compromised computer. In terms of the geography of that, again, you know, we're not looking necessarily at huge numbers of institutions, but obviously a big effect in terms of the money they can make. And again, it's a global thing, as so many cybercrime operations are these days. Now, I want to talk at this point about the wider threat landscape just briefly, and you might think this sort of belongs at the beginning of the session, but I'm doing it for a reason. So at the moment, what I've talked about is very, very targeted attacks, stuff from the top of this pyramid. So if we're representing all threats in this pyramid way. 90% of them are those random attacks that I started talking about: banking Trojans, ransomware, cryptocurrency mining, backdoors, keyloggers, all of that stuff. Adware comes into that category as well. The targeted stuff is a much smaller percentage, but obviously the gains are much bigger. If you compromise a bank infrastructure, you can make tons more money than getting access to my account. And then right at the top, we've got the stuff where nation states get involved in doing the stuff that nation states do, but like the rest of us, they're using technology to do it these days. So why talk about this at this stage? Well, you might have heard of Lazarus, and Lazarus is a group which belongs firmly up here, and actually in the very top bit, because it's almost certainly nation-state sponsored. And Lazarus's kind of aim, and it dates back quite a few years now, it's been operating about 8 or 9 years, I think. And cyber espionage has been its sort of main thrust for most of that time. You might remember the attack on Sony Pictures in 2014. Lazarus was responsible for that. You might remember the attacks which used the SWIFT network for stealing money from the Bangladesh bank just 18 months ago. Again, they were responsible for that. And that's the interesting thing. So cyber espionage is their main thing. Cyber sabotage, in some cases. With the Sony attack, they were stealing information and then wiping data off machines. But more recently, the last couple of years, they've spun off a separate group called Blue Noroff. Still part of the overall group, but their aim is cryptocurrency mining and theft of money. Cryptocurrency mining because everybody's speculating on cryptocurrencies, and some people are building big farms to generate, Bitcoin or whatever it is. What these guys are doing really is sometimes they're attacking cryptocurrency exchanges, but other times they're controlling people's CPUs to generate cryptocurrency for them. But the money theft side of it is huge. And as I say, the SWIFT attack, which I'll talk about in a moment, was one of their attacks. So why get into money making? Well, because it funds other operations. The whole thing becomes self-funding if you do that, and not a drain on whatever state is behind it. Geography of their attacks over the years. Again, it's not covering the whole world, but actually it's not localized in a particular place, actually. And this, again, is just what we've got visibility into. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the whole picture. Probably the biggest attack was that they're responsible for in terms of making money was the attack on the Bangladesh bank. And their aim was to use the SWIFT system to instruct an American financial institution to pay money to an account in the Philippines, debiting the Bangladesh bank. So they stood to gain, if it had been completely successful, about $950,000. Most of that was recovered through the system, through stopping transactions. But about 81 I should say million, not thousands, 81 million was unaccounted for, so we presume that that's what they got away with. And kind of, the tactics are not that different to some of the stuff I've talked about already. So initially, whether you're talking about some lowly banking Trojan or a nation-state attack, often the first step is compromise somebody, compromise a person, trick them into doing something that they shouldn't. That jeopardizes the organization's security. And that's a standard thing. It's also the case that they will often use third-party tools, things like PowerShell, tools used by admins, in order to kind of move from machine to machine within an organization to get where they want to be from a strategic point of view. No different there. In this case, with the resources that groups like this have, they will often develop then custom malware. So once they get in, they're getting in with standard mechanisms, but once they're there, they've got custom software that they deploy as a sort of second stage, which is specifically tailored to whatever they want to do. And in this case, with the SWIFT attacks, they were looking to create custom software that would interact with the SWIFT system for their own benefit. This is courtesy of BAE Systems. You can read all about their blog there if you Google that. But basically, they were looking to monitor all of the information sent through the SWIFT system at the Bangladesh bank with a view to reading all of the transactions. And then what they were doing was modifying them so that they were changing accounts and so on. And they were even going to the lengths of modifying confirmation sent to the printer. So there would be a physical printout of a transaction. They were modifying the data sent to the printer so that somebody doing a physical check said, yeah, everything looks okay. But behind the scenes, the money was going elsewhere. So what do we do in terms of, as organizations, in terms of blocking this kind of stuff? And it's, in terms of banks, you've got the infrastructure itself, but you've also got a whole raft of customers who are also potentially vulnerable. And you might think, well, actually, that's not coming off the bank's bottom line. That's hitting me and you. But they care about it, which is why, they invest in two-factor authentication, which is why often banks will say, we'll make available to you free XYZ software to protect yourself. So for customers, it comes down to pub. And, I don't mean go and find somewhere to have a drink, but protect yourself, update, and back up pub. So protect yourself with internet security software because you significantly raise the bar. Could somebody compromise your computer if it's got internet security on it? Yeah, they could. Just as at home, they could get in even if you have a burglar alarm and window locks and a deadbolt on the front door. But you really raise the bar for entry level into that. And the same with this. Backup's going to protect you against things like ransomware. Backups are a good idea anyway because hardware fails eventually. Updates, often attacks will use vulnerabilities in applications or the operating system as a way of installing their code. If you apply updates as soon as they become available, you reduce their window of opportunity for doing that. So for customers, just those three things alone are going to really reduce your exposure to risk. What about for organizations? Well, I've divided it into right now and tomorrow, but in reality it isn't. You've got to drain the swamp and you've got to fight off the alligators. You can't do them both separately. But breaking down into technology updates and network management. So technology, these days it's a question of protecting all kinds of devices, not just traditional computers. So we talk about smartphones as well. It also includes not just scanning for known malware, but proactive technologies, and indeed going for a sort of default deny approach where you say the only things that can run on this system are the stuff that is on the whitelist. If it's not on the whitelist, it doesn't get to run. And that's going to really limit the scope of any attacker. Updates, again, patching is really, really important. We look back at Q3 and at doing a sort of general what's happening in malware. And interestingly enough, we found tens of thousands of WannaCry attacks. Now, WannaCry, you'll remember from last year, early last year, April time, May time. And the patch for it existed even then. But still, it's having some success because people aren't patching. Network management. You can do a lot just with having a process. So, one of the dangers is you give lots of people admin access automatically. Well, if you do that, you're giving admin access to an attacker if they compromise that computer. Similarly with write access. If people don't need write access to particular data, don't give them write access. The Australian Signals Directorate, which is their equivalent of GCHQ, estimates that 4 things would reduce the risk of a targeted attack, not the random speculative stuff, but the higher level stuff, a targeted attack. About 70% of them could be blocked with just 4 things. The 4 things are default deny, in other words, use a whitelisting approach. The second is patch your operating system. The third is patch your applications. When an update's available, apply that update. And the third was not giving people admin rights automatically on computers. Those 4 things. Now, layered, on top of that, there's all the other stuff like educating staff, and that's got to be a cultural thing. Think about road safety. We don't teach children to cross this road at this time of the day. We want them to deal with any road traffic situation. And that's a cultural thing. The same with wearing seat belts, not drink driving, and the rest of it. So we need to kind of change people's views so they think in a secure way. I can recall my first employer in this industry. We were using phones mainly for transactions then. And the culture was you pick the phone up in 3 rings. Doesn't matter if it's your phone or not, you pick it up in 3 rings. And I was heading tech support at the time, and I'd go to conferences like Partner Conference or something like that. And the CEO would say, we pick the phone up in 3 rings. Don't we, David? And he'd dial a number, he'd put it on speaker, and I'd be thinking, God, please pick the phone up, somebody. But they did, because that was the culture. And it didn't happen overnight, but you can shape people's behavior. Strategy is really important. So looking at, what systems have we got? What data have we got? Where is it? What kind of system? Who has access to it? And from that, who else might want to get access to? And if they did, how would they do it? And it's trying to, even if you're not employing somebody externally as a penetration tester, you're taking that sort of approach. Sometimes it is important to delegate to experts. It is bigger than IT because actually if you want to change culture, you're going to need buy-in from senior management, you're going to need HR, you're going to need maybe the legal team and so on. So it's quite complicated, but actually whatever size organisation somebody is, that's where the process starts. So with that, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions. I know we have to kind of finish now, but if you have questions, come and see me afterwards, or come see one of my colleagues on the table out there. Be happy to talk to you. Thank you very much.